I figured out that I was autistic at 34 and got an official diagnosis at 35. And things just all of a sudden made sense. It's like,
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. I am so delighted to have Heather Cook with us today. She is an autistic advocate who is also a professional certified coach who helps later identified autistics to break free from a lifetime of shoulds and neurotypical expectations to create a life that truly works. We are going to talk more about that. But before we do, Heather, thanks so much for joining me today.
my pleasure.
And for the people who haven't had the lovely opportunity to meet you yet, can you share a little bit more about you?
I figured out that I was autistic at 34 and got an official diagnosis at 35. And things just all of a sudden made sense. It's like, oh, that's why this happened that way. That's why I responded to this that way. Why this is why this other person reacted to me this way. And like there were so many things that made sense. And I spent a few years doing a really, really deep dive into myself and processing who I am and what this means for me and what I want to do with my life. And I have the kind of brain that is really good at pattern recognition and problem solving and systematizing. Like I can see things in what seems to others like entirely unrelated systems and see how they affect each other. And I could see how much of my life had been influenced by things that I had no idea about. And I mean, I could go into that in incredible detail, but in general, understanding what was going on was incredibly useful for me. It was revelatory. And once I understand, like, oh, I'm not broken, I'm autistic, it gave me a new lens to look through. And it was like, okay, so all of these things that I struggle with, all of these things that I just can't figure out, these things that I feel like I'm a failure at or inept at, but other people around me seem to be doing just fine with them. Like, what's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
And yet I also am quite smart and can figure out other things really well, better than a lot of other people. Like this contradiction has been very painful for me most of my life. And once I could figure out, oh, this is why, it's like I process things differently. I see the world differently. I figure things out in a different way. And it's this particular way, this particular lens. It's not just that I can't function. It was a way into saying, okay, now I see what's going on. Now I can do something about it. Because if I don't understand what's happening, it's just
Mm-hmm.
it's not useful. It's like I can't do anything about it because I don't know what to fix. I don't know what to solve. I don't know what to work at. So when I figured out that I'm autistic, it was like, okay, now I can approach things in a different way. Like I have a framework. And so I did that. And I basically spent a few years really entirely reinventing my life. And um, and I've created a life for myself now that is incredibly low stress, that I describe as a sensory haven.
Mm-hmm.
Like my room is set up for my sensory needs. Um, I have systems in my life where I don't have to do most of the things that I struggle with doing. And when I do have to do them, I have the capacity because I'm not wasting that capacity fighting myself for 90% of my life. And it's like, oh, this is what it could look like. Like this is what life could be like.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk to people every day as a coach that are basically where I was 10 years ago or at different places in my journey, and they're still trying to figure that stuff out. And so I work with them on how do you get to this place where things actually work, mostly at least, and when they don't, like, you can deal with it and it doesn't like ruin everything. You don't just collapse in on yourself or explode and melt down, and like things more or less you can manage.
Yeah. And I really value how you just pictured I created a life and how you help others to create a life that truly works, that recognizes that your needs and your strengths are different, and that these strengths in a world that's often formed in what we call a neurotypical way, it often puts people in a position where, as you mentioned, you on your website, you help people overcome a lifetime of shoulds.
Mhm.
As you mentioned, I'm seeing this person and they seem to be thriving in this environment, which sounds like it could be very overstimulating and not cater to your needs, and judges us off of certain parameters that might miss key strengths that people who are autistic have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you and I had planned to talk about autistic burnout and how to get out of it. And from what you were painting, I'm like, that definitely sounds like before the awareness of trying to mold and fit in and maybe not yet be in tune with your needs, can certainly understand why the stress would be cumulative and adding to chronic burnout. But I'd love to hear more from your standpoint. What is autistic burnout? And what do you think tends to play into putting people at risk?
Autistic burnout, as I see it, is essentially when your the stresses in your life have built up and accumulated so much for so long that your reserves have been maxed out and you can't keep doing what you're doing. Like, you can't just dig deep. You can't push through it. You can't get through one more thing. You can't drag yourself through one more. Like, you don't have that capacity left anymore because you've been doing that for so long. Like, your well of energy is entirely empty. There just isn't anything left to draw from. And the body, as a self-protective mechanism, tries to help us by shutting down so that because if we were to continue trying to do that any longer, whatever it is we're doing, like dealing with all of those stresses, pushing beyond our limits, we physically cannot do it anymore. And it would physically hurt us or kill us to keep doing that. So our body says, nope, we're not doing this. And it shuts down. And sometimes that's sort of like a gradual creep. And sometimes it's like you went over the cliff and
Mm-hmm.
it's just not happening anymore. Um, and I've had both of those experiences. I've had the gradual creep and I've had the I just fell over a cliff kind of in really big dramatic life halting ways a couple of times, and in smaller ways off and on throughout my entire life.
I am sorry to hear that you've experienced such depths of burnout. I know it can be quite devastating mentally,
Mhm.
spiritually, physically, emotionally. And I know you well from our conversations that you have been able to develop the tools in order to help yourself through that period of time and then help others. But before we dive in to the
Mhm.
things that you did and how you help others, when you were talking about that experience of I just can't do this anymore, what came to mind was how often masking can create that chronic stress and people
Oh,
might
yeah.
not be aware. Can you talk a
Uh-huh.
little bit more about masking?
So, in brief, masking is a term that we use in the autistic community to describe essentially trying to be neurotypical. It's, I mean, to some extent, everyone puts up a little bit of a social front, at least sometimes. That's normal, and it's not necessarily an unhealthy thing to do. But when it becomes unhealthy is when you're pretending to be someone that you're not, or pretending to imitate other people's reactions because, oh, this is the appropriate facial expression to have with this particular conversation. Oh, this is the time where I'm supposed to smile and laugh because other people would expect it of me. When you're doing that, um, so often that you actually lose touch with what your actual reactions are. Like, you don't know what you feel anymore. You don't know what you would like because you're so used to conforming to what other people like. You don't know what your opinions are, what your needs are, what your wants are, what your desires, what your hopes, what your dreams are, because you don't feel like you're allowed to do that because the expectations of all the people around you are so intense, and you've gotten so much feedback in the past that when you have tried to be yourself, that was an inappropriate thing, that
Mm,
was not what was expected of you, that was not okay to them. And this can be sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in very explicit or dramatic ways, sometimes in abusive ways. But when you've gotten that message and your reaction to it is to mask in order to find safety, and it usually is a strategy for safety. Um, it's it may be very useful in that situation where you are genuinely in danger, or where your your parents being willing to take care of you and provide you with the support that you need is at risk as a child. But when it continues even after those situations have passed, um, and I want to be careful there because for some adults, they're still in those kinds of situations. Like, I don't want to pretend that it's just as easy as growing up. It's not for some of us. It's
mhm.
um, people remain in dangerous situations, either specifically overtly like abusive situations, or just their minority status, their identity, who they are is not acceptable to larger society. Um, and some sort of masking remains necessary. But my point with all of this is that kind of masking, that kind of pretending, both detaches us from knowing, like genuinely knowing what we want or
Yeah.
what we need. And then we can't meet our own needs if we don't know what they are. But it also takes an enormous amount of energy. It's just freaking hard to override your own innate responses all the time. It's hard to fight yourself all the time. And it feels like you're fighting yourself inside, or like you're not allowed to be yourself. And that's incredibly energy draining. And so, yeah, it does lead a lot of us to burnout, that among other things.
And it seems like the abandonment of who we are, right? Because what we're told is that who we are isn't appropriate, as you mentioned. It isn't enough. And
Hmm.
so, in abandoning who we are in order to feel safe or accepted, we can actually lose sight of who am I?
Hmm.
And I'm curious kind of what people should expect as they gain awareness of, oh, wow, I've been changing myself to fit in, and that journey to find themselves. And I asked this question from my own perspective of like, it wasn't, as kind of highlighted, it wasn't like, oh, now that I realize that things are all better, right? It was
Yeah.
like painful to realize that in denying ourselves and in trying to be who others wanted us to be, we were continuously told that we weren't enough, and that was reinforced. and to allow ourselves to realize like we are more than enough. We deserve to be unconditionally loved exactly who we are. Like that can be
Hmm.
painful.
Yeah.
Uh, at least not from my experience, but I'd love to hear from your experience and from people that you've worked with.
Yeah, it is painful. One thing that was going through my mind as you were just talking now is Martha Beck is fond of saying that people don't hurt when they lose the dream, they hurt when they find it again,
Mhm.
or something like that. I'm paraphrasing it. But it's like after I figured out I was autistic and I made some very conscious major changes in my life in order to give myself the space to process, I literally, well, I'd already essentially quit my job. I was working a little bit part-time, but that was literally all I could handle because I was in such deep burnout is one very small part-time class. Um, I was a teacher at the time. And so I quit that. I rented out my house. I bought a van, converted the van into a living space, and like moved into the van and just went off and lived in forests
Oh
and
my
toured the
gosh.
country for 3 years until the
Wow.
pandemic hit and stopped that. Um, but that time was the most painful and hard period of my life. It was also the best and most wonderful period of my life. And I uh, discovered I had things called tears, and they made themselves known in a big way. I found out that I had a lot of anger that I was not able to express or even didn't even realize I had. And I was very angry for a while. I had to process through a lot of stuff, and it was it was really hard. And it gave me the life that I have now, and I loved it in so many ways, but it was also incredibly difficult, both at a physical level of just like everything is different and I don't have anyone to rely on, and because I'm alone in a van and everything is physically works differently. Um, and I'm in a different place every few days and all sorts of stuff. But also at a very much emotional level, it was just a lot of emotions to deal with, and I was not used to doing that. I grew up essentially modeling Mr. Data and Mr. Spock, and they were my idols, and I did not trust emotions and repressed them and suppressed them so much that I was actually diagnosed alexithymic. Like I literally did not have access to my emotions. I would sit in my therapist office and be yelling about something, and she would ask me to put my hand on my heart, and there my heart was at like resting heart rate. I
Mm,
had no physical connection. So clearly I was upset about something,
yeah.
but I could not feel it. And so starting to make those connections again with my body was painful. It's also been really, really useful for me. And now I'm totally a proponent of creating that connection. But I recognize that the process is hard. Um, it brought up some traumas. It brought up, I mean, I had to figure out how like this emotion thing works.
You took on this journey alone and also mentioned you had a therapist, and just thinking back to that time about what do you think if you had to do it again you would have done again, and what would you have done differently?
Wishful thinking, since this is an entirely invented scenario. I'd have done most of it pretty much the same, but the probably the hardest thing for me was a very practical thing, which was my only income source was the small difference between what my renters were paying me for my house and my mortgage. I was living off of $300 a month, and
Wow.
that had to cover my van gas, my insurance, my any healthcare, my food, everything. And um, I did a couple of little odd jobs here and there, and I did a couple of side gigs occasionally to get money, and had a couple of people give me a small gift here and there, which was very generous and very useful. But for the most part, that was the hardest thing. And I made the intentional choice over and over and frickin' over again to not get a job, to not just fix this by putting myself into the situation that kind of got me into this situation.
Wow.
And one thing that I was learning in this process was that it's very important to match short-term problems with short-term solutions and long-term problems with long-term solutions. And it's when you mix those up that people get into really bad situations. And what I mean by that is, okay, my financial difficulties sucked. It was incredibly hard. And I didn't have money for most of the things that I needed. Like pretty much anything that was not basic survival, there wasn't money for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was incredibly frustrating because there's a lot of things that would have been very beneficial for me if I'd had a little bit more money. So my ideal scenario is I would have had a little bit more money.
Mm.
But I also knew that doing that would have been that would have been a long-term solution to a short-term problem. Like not having a job, not having another source of income felt like a big deal. And it was, I don't want to minimize that. It was. But at the same time, I was managing. I was surviving. It didn't ever feel like enough, but I survived. So at some level, like at a very, very basic level, it was. But if I had gotten a job, I did not have the energy at that point to barely do more than take care of myself. Sometimes just making a meal or two was like, well, that's the rest of the day. That is all I had. And I would spend hours just lying on my bed, staring out the window at the birds in the local area or wherever little forest scene that I had. And that was very restorative to me. But sometimes that was literally all I had the capacity for. So if I had gotten a job, I would have gotten a short-term influx of cash, but I would have put me behind in my actual burnout recovery. And I recognized that. So I chose not to put myself in that position and to deal with the consequences, which is not much money for basically everything that I needed.
The word courage comes to mind. Do you feel at the time now or looking back that it took a lot of courage in order to honor that?
That's a term I hadn't thought about in relation to this before. I think some people in my family would have called it stubbornness. But yeah, I think to some extent that does fit because I knew what was right for me and I knew what society was saying was what I should be doing.
Yeah.
And it definitely took courage to buck that trend, to buck the impulse, to tell all of the people who just said, well, just get a job. Like, no, that's not the right thing for me right now.
Yeah. It also feels like there's that element of you had the intuition, you had the understanding, that self-trust. Like I can trust that what I've identified is if I throw myself back into the situation that got me here, it's not going to meet this goal that I have, which is to get out of the state of burnout.
Which I have. I have not had another burnout since then. And like that last burnout was in 2015. And I mean, the recovery process took a few years, but I have not had a burnout since then. And I've been working essentially full time for the last 4 years. And I've never done that before in my life. Never have I held a job for, like, I've never held a full-time job for more than 2 years. I've never held most jobs for 3 years. Um,
I definitely want to help people get to the solutions, but before we do, you were a teacher, you're a student of the education system.
uh-huh.
Looking at the education system and our expectations for work. I've applied to some jobs recently. One of them required you to sit in an office that was open floor. And I was like, it's not, I mean, and then to even get work accommodations, I had thoughts about that. I'm like, even, if people aren't autistic, if they have different work styles, I'm like, I think that this is known to actually not be that compatible with productivity, but for somebody who can be very overstimulated and not function that environment. And then during the interview, when I mentioned that, I felt very judged. So, but back to
Yep.
the education, just thinking about how our education system is not only made for extroverts, very overstimulating, and it has these measurements of success that are quite biased. So,
Yes. Mhm.
love your perspective on the education system.
How much time you got?
We have a lot of conversations that we can have. So, as much as you want to offer today, and I'd love to
Yeah.
have you on as many times as possible to go over these other topics in depth.
Yeah. Uh, when I was doing my teaching certificate, they told us as sort of a cautionary tale that most teachers tend to teach the way that they learn, and they were trying to say, like, pay attention to other learning styles for the students you teach. I think that that's very true,
Mhm.
and I think that the education system is set up that way. Like, they need to listen to their own advice.
Mhm.
It's the entire education system is built for one very specific learning style. It's assessed in one very specific way. It has a very, very narrow idea of what is learning, of what education is, of how it's possible to demonstrate understanding, learning, competence. Um, and, and there's reasons for all of this, which we don't need to get into right now, but it's basically designed to be really, really good for a certain type of learners and to teach everyone else that they are not okay.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of students leave school thinking that they aren't smart, but they are. They're incredibly intelligent. And their types of intelligence aren't fostered. They're not demonstrated. They're not catered to. They're not hardly acknowledged sometimes. And we spend most of the time teaching those kids, which is the majority of students, by the way, basically how to sit still. Like, they are told, sit down, face forward, listen to me. No, we're not doing that right now. No, it's not time for that. No, put all four legs of the chair on the floor. Nope, can't do that. Nope, not that. And most of the time, what these kids are trying to do is to regulate themselves.
Yeah.
They need to fidget, they need to move, they need to think, they need to doodle, but that's not allowed. It's not, they, in my teacher training, they showed us this video. It was a whole series of videos from this school, and it's supposed to be like this advanced, really great school for kids who are underprivileged, and they take these kids and they give them a really great education, and they wouldn't have otherwise gotten this great education. And basically the entire school, every class is the kids have to sit, and they're in uniforms, and they have to sit at their desk and put their hands folded on their desk in front of them and look at the teacher the entire time. And if they do anything like scratch something, their teacher is, while lecturing in front of the classroom, is going around and pointing at them and giving them like these little hand signals of, you're not supposed to do that. Remember, hands folded. And they do that. They'll just, like, the teacher will go around and go like this and point at the student because they've broken the norm. They've broken what they're supposed to do. And how how are you supposed to learn like that? They're not even allowed to take notes. In a lot of schools, you're supposed to take notes. They can't because their hands are folded on their desk in front of them. And that's an extreme example, but it kind of speaks to where we're going. And this is supposed to be a model of an advanced, really great school that is providing this great education to these underprivileged, low-income students. And I'm just going, I'm shuddering watching this. And then I get into my classroom, and on the first day of school, I do not give them a list of rules. I do not tell them where to sit. What I did on the first day of every school year is, with each of my class, I taught high school and community college, but mostly like in my high school class, at the first day of every school year, I would talk to each of my classes and I would basically say, okay, here's the deal. You've been in school for 9, 10, 11, 12 years. You know how this works. You know what you're expected to do, what you're not expected to do. So I don't need to give you a list of rules. You know basically how to behave and how to be a reasonable person. If you just take care of yourself, take care of your needs, and be generally decent to each other, we're fine. If that becomes an issue at some point, we'll talk about it. And the sigh of relief and the look of thanks that I got from all of my classes was palpable. And I never once had to send anyone to the office for any transgressions. I never had issues with almost any students. Occasionally someone would try and push a little bit, but I would be like, really? Really? And they would just laugh and like they knew that I was onto it. It was like, it just wasn't an issue because I trusted them and I let them take care of their needs. And they would ask me like, but can we eat in class? I'm like, yeah, but do we have to bring stuff for everyone? Why would you? Like, just be reasonable. If you're hungry, you can't think, you can't learn while you're hungry. So eat something. If you spill, clean it up. If you have gum, throw it in the waste bin, not under the desk. Like, I'm not going to catch you out on stuff. Just take care of yourself.
Yeah.
If you need to get up and move around, just don't block other people. Go move in the back. If you want to sit somewhere else, go move. I don't care. And I had engaged students. Like, I do not see why this is so hard.
Yeah, I feel like education could certainly be a whole nother discussion. We could elaborate on this for quite a while. And because I could ask you a whole bunch of questions, I'm going to pause myself and doing that. Tell the audience or ask the audience. I don't tell you what to do. I invite you. I will invite you. If you are experiencing aspects of the education system that are not helpful and we can wave a wand and everything would just be glorious and supportive of you, please share that in the comments below. And of course, Heather, if we want to have another conversation and specifically on education, I think that would be a very great topic. But because I keep promising people we're going to give them the tools to help get out of burnout, how about we dive into that?
Okay.
What has been kind of your path and some of the tools that you found in your own life and what helps your clients get out of autistic burnout?
So I've been spending the last year or so trying to systematize that, trying to figure that out, because I clearly did it myself. And I've helped quite a few clients with making significant improvements in that direction. And it's like, okay, so what does it actually take? And I think that there's more or less 5 areas that need to be addressed. I don't there's lots of advice out there on burnout and just like dealing with stress. And some of it's really good. Some of it's questionable or just not applicable to us. Um, but I don't think that it's just get some extra rest, take some bubble baths, get a babysitter. Like, yeah, those are nice if you can, but it's not enough. It's not really enough to get you out of burnout, and it's not enough to keep you out of burnout. I think that it needs to be a holistic approach. And these 5 areas are like we talked about masking. To the extent that it is safe, when it is available to you, even if that's just in the privacy of your own bedroom, even while you're living with other people, but like, or at home alone if you're alone, but like to whatever extent it's possible, you need to figure out what's you and what's the mask and do a little bit less masking. And that will free up energy to do other things. You need to figure out your sensory needs and what's being met and what's not being met. And some things are going to be small and easy to deal with, but you've got these voices in your head saying that it's not okay because that's a stupid thing to need, or that's not reasonable, or whatever. We'll get into that in a sec, but like, or there's like, this isn't normal for people. Okay, so what? I tend to brush my teeth while standing on one leg. It's improved my balance considerably, but it's the only way that I can get myself to brush my teeth because I have a lot of oral sensitivities, and I spend about a decade not brushing my teeth more than about 2 or 3 times a week. And I have had a lot of dental work in the last couple of years to help correct some of the consequences of that. But at the time, the consequences were less important to me than I will literally gag if I put anything in my mouth that is not food. I even went through a phase where I couldn't put silverware in my mouth. But so now I've tried every kind of toothbrush, every kind of toothpaste, I tried Mizwax sticks, like just brushing my teeth with little sticks like they do in the Middle East. That was actually pretty good for a while. Turns out what works for me is bamboo toothbrushes and standing on one leg. A particular natural toothpaste. I've tried a whole bunch of them. This one has almost no flavor, but like that works for me. So what if it looks weird? No one's watching me brush my teeth. This is in the privacy of my own bathroom at home. Freaking who cares? So like making those little adjustments and sometimes big adjustments, making my office actually comfortable for me, having lots of plants in here, having the color be pleasant to me. It's a soothing color, like just having a couple of my stuffed animals and having little knickknacks and having some water handy. And I have a basket of snacks over there so that I can always have something handy because my blood sugar gets low very quickly. And I basically end up eating little bits all throughout the day. As long as I'm awake, I'm probably eating or just a few minutes from it. But that's what I need. So what if that's not what other people need? It makes my body work. So like the sensory stuff is another area. And those voices in your head saying, this isn't normal, it's not okay to do this, like that is all internalized ableism. And so another big area is figuring out what you've internalized from society that is saying that you need to do things a particular way, or it's not okay to do it a particular way, and finding those and dismantling them gently, slowly. Too quickly, and then we get our defense mechanisms going up and it feels overwhelming. But a little bit at a time, saying like, really, does it actually matter how I brush my teeth? Does it actually matter what the inside of my house looks like? It's not getting ready for a photo shoot. It's not going to get into any magazine. Like, I'm the one who's living here, and I basically have no one ever come over to my house. So why does it matter that it looks right for other people?
Yeah.
that was surprisingly big revelation to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Fear of other people's opinions is a big deal.
yeah, but we're trained to really value other people's opinions, even
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to very personal things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so another area is getting in tune, like we talked about, like that body awareness, is getting in tune with what's going on in your own body, because you can't know what all of your needs are until you know what's actually happening inside, both physically, like at a sort of sensory level of like, how do you figure out what your sensory needs are if you don't know how you're physically reacting to different things? And so that was a process of building up that ability and bringing those connections um, back. But also at an emotional level, at a gut level, at a psyche level of, how do I make decisions if I don't know what I'm thinking about things? And not just like your pros and cons list of what makes sense cognitively. Those are important. I will always use those. I love those. But there's also another level where sometimes there isn't an obvious answer with just the pros and cons. Sometimes there isn't a clear winner. So how do you make the decision about which thing you want,
Mm-hmm.
about which job to take, about whether you should leave this relationship or stay in it, about what you want to do with your life, about which career you want to, like if you want to switch careers, what do you want to go into? Um, all sorts of different things. Sometimes those are big examples, but it also can be small things of just like, what do I want to do on my day off? Or
Yeah.
what feels good? Like how do I know what's restorative
Mm-hmm.
in this whole process of burnout recovery? Like, what is actually restorative to me? Because it's going to be different for different people.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, going out and doing things is restorative. For some people, that's just an energy drain and they need to stay home. But you've also got this voice in your head that you're not supposed to do that, that's being a hermit, that's not okay. And that's the internalized ableism thing. So you can see how these are all related to each
Yeah.
other.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just deal with one. They're all connected. And the other one's energy management. It's so each of these other things, when you make some progress on it, it does free up some energy because you're not using that energy to fight off the world around you or to battle yourself inside or to try and figure out a decision, but without all of the information. Like all of these things free up energy, but how do you actually manage that energy? How do you know what is a good use of energy and what's not? How do you know when you're like when to push and when to push through something and when to stop?
Mm-hmm.
Like I went out yesterday and I actually paid to go somewhere to a local museum. They have a new science museum in our city, and it opened about 6 months ago, and I've really been wanting to go, but like it's new, therefore it's going to be crowded. Anyway, I finally went, and I paid money to get into this thing, but after like 2 hours, I was feeling kind of done. Like my
Mm-hmm.
sensory overwhelm was getting maxed out, and I had loop earplugs in and I had other things taking care of my senses, but it was just, in the past I probably would have pushed because I paid money for this. I need to get my full value. I didn't even see the whole floor upstairs. Like
Mm-hmm.
I need to keep watching everything. I need to do all the stuff. And I probably wouldn't have even noticed. Like I would have been a little bit more tetchy. I'd have been a little more irritable. I'd have been a little bit more short patience. Like I'd have probably had some physical reactions that I didn't notice, but were there. But I wouldn't have been aware of this stuff. So again, internal awareness is
Yeah.
useful. But even if I had been aware of it, I probably would have still pushed because I had other expectations. This is like the internalized ableism. I need to get my full value out of it. I need to do all of the things at the museum. I can't just see one floor and that's it. But I was noticing that I was getting towards overstimulation, and it would have been better for me to leave, and I did. I actually left after just a little less than 2 hours at the place. But I was physically able to notice that my, my energy was waning,
Mm,
and if I had spent another 20 minutes there, it would have started crashing.
yeah.
But in the past, I would not have noticed that.
Mm,
I would not have noticed it until I literally hit my wall and I shut down. That's my reaction. Some people melt down and it looks very big and it's an outward thing. Some of us shut down internally and we sort of collapse. And that's me. Like I will go mute. I will just like stop responding. I will stare into vacant space or at the floor. I will not answer anything. I will like, yeah, it's not pretty. Um, and it feels awful. But that's my body's way of protecting myself from continuing to do the thing that is hurting me even longer.
mm,
But as you get better at this stuff, you can start to notice your energy levels in real time and be able to respond to them in real time. And therefore, I left with energy left over and I still was able to do other things that afternoon. And that wouldn't have been the case before.
That's beautiful. I think about too, going forward, I often buy passes to things for the year. So then
Mhm.
I don't feel guilty, right? It's like
Yeah.
if I buy pass for the year, then I go, I check out an exhibit and I leave. And then I go and
Right.
but again, it took permission, right? Because they're like, well, other people are staying here all day and I made it here, right? The
Mhm.
sunk cost can be, I drove all the way here today, so I'm going
Yeah.
to stay. So just to recap, we had first, I love how you said dial down the masking, right? Like you don't have to strip everything off,
Yeah.
identify when you're safe to do so, dial down the masking. Two, become aware of your sensory needs and honor them.
Mhm.
Three, identify when you have internalized ableism and challenge that narrative. Four is getting in tune with how do these things make you feel. The embodiment is hard. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
And then five is energy management. I definitely see how all of these go together.
Yeah.
And the importance, I think, of not doing it alone. And I would love for you to discuss how you partner with people in order to aid them. One, maybe if they are recently diagnosed autistic, they're navigating burnout recovery, or doing anything that's finally creating a life that's true to themselves.
Yeah. And I would highly recommend if it's possible and if it's something that you're interested in, if you would like to find other people that are going through the same kind of stuff because it's so nice to know, oh, it's not just me. I thought it was because
Yeah.
I didn't have someone when I was figuring all this stuff out. I was literally figuring it out from scratch. And I think that's part of why it took me so long. And I think it's a transition that's going to take a while anyway, um but it took a whole lot longer because I was just trying to figure out how I do this and what is there to do, like what would actually
Mhm.
be helpful. It was a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error, a lot of frustrated crying about services that weren't available to me for various reasons, mostly financial, some location, some they're only available to children. And I'm like, uh, but but now I try and be that person for others. And I work with some people one-on-one, um, as like individualized coaching. So depending on where you are in your journey, I can partner with you and help you through whatever it is you're working on at the moment. And I'm also in the process of creating a course on this burnout recovery, on everything that I've learned, and not just through my own experience, but working with other people and having read extensively just because I'm constantly reading.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to systematize all of this stuff and be able to hand it to people on a silver platter and say, here's the stuff.
Mhm.
And but also not not in a way that's prescriptive, not in a
Yes.
way that is, here's what worked for me, therefore it should work for you, because
Yeah.
it doesn't work that way. We're
Yeah. That would be against everything we just talked about, right?
Yes, it would
Yeah.
be. So I'm really trying to make it a sort of a choose your own adventure style thing, so that
Yeah.
it's like, here's a bunch of different parts. What are you interested in now? And based upon that, what kind of is your next step? And what after that, what's your next step? And like, let it
Mhm.
be this interconnected, woven,
Yeah.
experiential thing, but at the same time, trying to make it in a way that it's not overwhelming, because, oh, there's too many options, then you get
Mhm.
paralyzed with choice. And so trying to create that is, again, another time of me trying to create something incredibly complex from scratch and not having a model for how to make it work. So that's why it's been taking a while.
Mhm.
Um, but I've actually made a fair amount of progress, and I'll be launching the first version of it later this summer. And hopefully some people will be willing to do the pilot version with
Yeah.
me and give me feedback, and we can make it better for the next version. Um, so I'm excited about that, and also trying really hard to do it in a way that is not going to put me into burnout, because
Yep.
I absolutely refuse to do that. But it
Mhm.
is a lot of work on top of everything else I'm doing.
Yeah. I like the iterations that you just said. It's iterate, have people that are going to give feedback, iterate, and not. I think a lot of us can get into the wanting it to be perfect the first time when it's not going to be. It's like, I'm going to do what we need and pivot as needed.
Hmm. Yeah.
We're we're going to have all the current links that you have, and this is going to be dynamic, just like your course. So any updates you give me, we're going to put those links down below as things
Mhm.
evolve. And are there any last takeaways? You've shared so much wisdom today. I really appreciate that. Any last takeaways you'd like to share with the audience?
I think the biggest thing that I help people with is trusting themselves. And so many of us who are neurodivergent have been trained to distrust ourselves. But you know inside what works for you. And you may have 1,000 voices in your head telling you why that's not okay, what the problem with that is, like all of the reasons why you can't do that. And some of those are practical and okay, fine, it might not work exactly the way you want, but there's a lot of them that are just that internalized ableism. Like, there might be a way to make it happen. And not saying that that's going to be easy. It probably won't be. But you know what works for you. Something inside you does. And the best parts of my work are when I can see someone trusting themselves and putting it into the world, and it works. And then they get a little bit more trust that they can do it again and again. And it builds that trust. It builds new neural connections of, I can do this.
Mhm.
I can be myself in the world. That's okay. Yeah, that's okay. Even if some people don't accept it, fine. Some people won't accept it. But can you be okay with that?
And people are going to not accept it even if you aren't yourself, right?
Yes.
You're going to
Yes.
get you're going to have people who reject you whether you are being yourself or not. So might as well be yourself.
Right. Yeah.
And what they think about you is a reflection of them, and what comes up for you is showing you a mirror about what's going on in your own thoughts and beliefs about yourself.
Mhm.
Beautiful. I love that message. And that really captured what I was envisioning when you just said enough is enough and you jumped in that van. There's that courage and element of self-trust, and now you're living it to give it.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. Of course, we're going to share all the ways to get in touch with Heather down below. Is there a preferred way that you'd like them to reach out to you?
My website is autismchrysalis.com, ChrYsalis. And I like email.
Perfect. All right. You heard that. We'll do Autism Chrysalis, email. Share your questions, your reflections, your insights from this discussion down below. We love to hear from you. Again, Heather, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Until next time, friends.
Okay.